Welcome to Capital Intelligence. Let's jump right into today's explainer. We're taking a deep dive into the latest macroeconomic data from three absolute heavyweights: the IMF, the World Bank, and the ILO. We're going to unpack what's really happening beneath the surface of the global economy right now. I want to start with this quote directly from the IMF: an apparent calm in a more fragile world. It honestly hits the nail on the head and captures the core paradox we're looking at today. Think of the global economy like a giant iceberg. Above the waterline, well, things look incredibly steady. But underneath, that's where we find these really deep, complex vulnerabilities. So our goal today is to look below that waterline and uncover what's actually going on. Section 1. The surface calm. Headline versus reality. Okay, let's dive right into this, starting with what we can see above the surface. Look, if you just glance at the top-level news, you'd probably think we're in this golden era of stability, right? Financial markets are looking surprisingly resilient, and global unemployment has dropped to its lowest level since before the pandemic. Sounds fantastic. But you have to contrast that with the underlying reality. Just below the surface, we've got mounting global debt, severe trade fragmentation as supply chains are drastically redrawn, and this really worrying growth in informal unprotected labor. So those positive headline numbers, they're essentially masking some massive negative caveats. And a perfect example of this surface calm is this next data point. Global GDP is projected to expand by 3.2% in 2025. Now, 3.2% sounds pretty steady, doesn't it? It feels safe. But the World Bank points out that when you zoom out a bit, this actually reflects a major downshift. Because of slower international trade and just stubbornly weak productivity, if these forecasts hold up, the average growth rate for this entire decade is going to be the lowest we've seen since the start of the 1960s. Simply put, the economic pie just isn't growing as fast as we're all used to. Section 2. Uneven global growth. Diverging economies. Now that headline 3.2% growth actually hides a pretty massive geographic disparity, and the sheer scale of this divergence is honestly staggering. 1 in 4. Nearly all high-income economies are going to be richer in terms of GDP per person than they were before the pandemic hit, yet 1 in 4 developing countries will actually be poorer today. That means a quarter of the developing world is literally sliding backward, completely unable to capitalize on that surface-level stability we were just talking about. Section 3. Labor market fragilities, decent work deficits. And you know, this inequality isn't just happening between nations. It's happening to everyday workers on the ground. The ILO actually calls this phenomenon job resilience amidst rising fragility. We're seeing really high labor force participation globally, which means, yes, people have jobs. But here's the catch. Having a job right now doesn't shield you from the severe cost of living crisis, driven by these fast-rising energy and food prices everywhere. People are working hard, but their paychecks just aren't stretching nearly as far. And this brilliantly illustrates our core theme today. Having a high quantity of jobs absolutely does not equal having secure, decent jobs. Just look at the hidden issues here. High informal employment means millions of workers are operating with zero legal protections or safety nets. We're seeing persistent working poverty, meaning even working a full-time job isn't enough to actually escape poverty anymore. And on top of that, the gender participation gap is still incredibly wide. So beneath that shiny low unemployment rate, there's a massive deficit in actual job quality. Section 4. Technology and gig work. Digital labor platforms. A huge driver of this shift in job quality is, of course, technology. To ground this abstract idea of algorithmic management in real human terms, just think about the delivery riders and remote digital workers who are completely reshaping our modern economy. These gig workers are navigating an entirely new landscape where, well, their boss is an algorithm. They face some highly unique challenges: wildly unpredictable hours, a total lack of benefits, and usually a complete absence of any traditional workplace grievance systems. To try and address this, the ILO is actively pushing for something absolutely crucial: core labor standards, or CLSs. Basically, these are universal fundamental rights. We're talking freedom of association, the complete abolition of forced and child labor, anti-discrimination, and most recently added to the list, the fundamental right to a safe working environment. The big challenge we face today is figuring out exactly how to apply these deeply established standards directly to the rapidly expanding and frankly severely underregulated digital platform economy. But while technology is clearly reshaping labor on the ground, it is also completely reshaping the highest levels of global finance. And that brings us to a really fascinating warning from the IMF about the current massive wave of artificial intelligence investment.
The IMF is explicitly pointing out that the enormous influx of capital going into AI right now strongly recalls the exuberance of the late 90s dot-com boom. On the one hand, market valuations are incredibly stretched. If the massive profit expectations around AI prove to be unfounded, we run the risk of a really sharp, painful financial correction. But, on the other hand, AI could absolutely become that vital source of global productivity that we saw was missing back in our GDP discussion. It's a total double-edged sword, and global markets are basically balancing right on the blade as we speak.
Section 5. Financial System Vulnerabilities. Hidden Systemic Risks. Now, all this high-stakes tech investment is happening within a broader financial architecture that has its own underlying cracks. So the crucial point here is that while the IMF does note traditional banks are generally stronger today than they were back in 2023, global stress tests are still revealing some quiet vulnerabilities. Take the global CET1 capital ratio, which is basically a key indicator of a bank's solvency and health. Under an adverse economic scenario, this ratio drops from a comfortable 13% down to 12.3%. Look, it's not a catastrophic failure by any means, but it definitely proves that our financial padding is a bit thinner than we might like to think when those sudden economic shocks happen. But, traditional banks aren't even the whole story anymore. We're seeing a really rapid expansion of emerging risks from things like non-bank financial intermediaries, or NBFIs, which you've probably heard called shadow banking. Alongside that, there's a huge expansion in stablecoins and tokenized assets. These entities are completely reshaping money markets, but they largely sit entirely outside traditional regulatory perimeters. When you combine all of that with rising sovereign debt across the globe, you get a seriously heightened risk of financial contagion if a sudden period of stress hits the markets. Section 6. Rebuilding Global Resilience, the Path Forward. So we've mapped out the iceberg of risks lurking underneath the surface, from informal labor and gig work to AI bubbles and shadow banking. So what is the actual path forward? Well, these institutions have put together a unified playbook designed to reinforce global resilience against future shocks. Step 1. Governments absolutely must rebuild their fiscal buffers and policy credibility, so they actually have the money to spend when the next crisis hits. Step 2. Fully implement the Basel III regulations to keep the banking sector's capital ratios nice and strong. Step 3. Apply those core labor standards to the digital platform economy to make sure gig workers are actually protected. And finally, Step 4. Revive predictable, rules-based international trade to combat all this fragmentation and try to boost that lagging global productivity. That is the playbook. But the reality of actually implementing it in a highly fragmented world is incredibly difficult. Which brings us to the ultimate takeaway from today's explainer. Now that you know about the iceberg beneath the surface, the mounting debt, the stretched AI valuations, the highly vulnerable gig workforce, are our current global buffers actually strong enough to survive the shifting ground beneath our feet? Honestly, it's the most vital question in economics today, and I'm going to leave you to ponder it. Thank you for joining me, and keep looking beneath the surface.